Hello and welcome to Perspectives, a daily show that we'll be producing in amongst our podcasts and other regular news items. And in this show, we'll be bringing you a daily dose of news and views covering the topics that we hope are relevant to you, our audience. And joining me for Perspectives is our very own correspondent in Canada for Satellite TV News, James Cousineau. Hello, James.
Good day, Angus. I hope the weather's treating you well on that side of the pond. It's beautiful here in sunny Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada.
Indeed. And of course, together, we'll be bringing you our perspectives on the daily news affecting the Sikh community across the world. Now, each show will probably be slightly different, but as a guide, we'll be covering daily news items that we've picked out from the media that we think should be highlighted and, of course, discussed. And we will be providing our perspectives on those stories. And in today's show, as well as this, we'll be covering a few comments that we've received on the channel, some good and of course some bad. And again, we'll be giving our reaction to those. Again, some good and some bad. And finally, as this week, of course, has been marking the 40th anniversary of the terrible events of 1984, we'll also be taking a look back at part of that week in June to remind our viewers of just how significant those events were. So, sit back, relax, and to kick us off, James, what story have you picked to start us off today with?
So, with the recent election in India, of course, there were over 600 million people who voted in the election. With it coming up, Modi was expecting to have a landslide win, which of course was not the case, and he had to rely on the other party to bring him forward to get the number of seats that he required to take his position again for a third term. He only reached under actually the halfway mark of 272 seats that he required out of the 543 seats that were available. So they were expecting, again, a comfortable landslide win, which did not happen. That, of course, makes a difference in how things are going to be controlled and how government will rule. The responses in terms of international media coverage when they dealt with this issue and talking about the election, I thought it was interesting to look at some of the topics that the press were putting forward and their points of view. And we'll start here with the New York Times. And they stated as quotes here, the New York Times newspaper ran a story with the headline, Modi's party wins, but it's far from a landslide. That was on the front page of the New York Times when the results were declared. The announcement further went on to state that the results announced on Tuesday were unexpectedly sobering. So that really says a lot and carries a lot of weight with how the Modi government expected the vote to go and how it actually went. The story mentioned in the New York Times again that instead of a runaway win, the BJP lost dozens of seats and now has to depend on its coalition partners to stay in power. It did not miss that one of the coalition partners is known for often switching sides. So that's a very interesting follow-up at the tail end of the story about how that party has tended to switch sides and how that could impact the Modi government going forward for this next term. The next one was the Times of London. And they reported that the BJP now has to rely on the backing from the National Democratic Alliance to form a government in the country. That's something that we just touched on. That was covered in the New York Times story. And they went on to carry an opinion that the country's poorest voters stopped the BJP from winning outright. Now, that, of course, we don't know how the poor voted. So that's just speculation. So I just thought it was important to bring that forward in terms of how the poor in the country voted. The next story that I thought we would just touch on was from Global News right here in Canada. And they went on to say that the BJP lost seats to stronger than expected opposition. And that highlighted also that it was the first time since 2014 that the ruling party did not secure a majority on its own. So again, that they've had to rely on a second party to be in power. The report called the results a stunning blow in the face of hopes of a landslide victory, which we've already touched on in that regard. And they finished off their story saying that the BJP will now be heavily dependent on the goodwill of its allies. And again, if the party decides to switch direction, they can cause the Modi government some challenges moving forward. So very important points of interest in relation to the election. Of course, over 600 million people voted. It's the largest election in the world and has a lot of impact on the stability of international relations within that region.
A very much weakened
That's
Narendra Modi.
for the first part there, Angus. Feel free to throw in your comments there, because I think that it was very important for the Modi government to actually have this reality check, in my opinion, to say, that they've lost a lot of support that they thought they had.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating result because, yes, there was this expectation that the BJP would sweep again to power with this goal of over 400 seats. And in fact, as it turns out, they've struggled to maintain governance. So they've had to rely effectively on a coalition to remain in power. So we have a much weakened Narendra Modi. Politics is clearly shifting in India in a very interesting direction. So let's have a look at your next story, James.
Okay, so in follow-up to that, I wanted to just touch on the reaction of world leaders, which I found very interesting in the fact that we'll get to Canada's reaction in a minute here. But this goes on, and I'm taking this from a story that was published online by Devesh Kumar. And that headline in itself was essentially just going on to say how Canada or world leaders reacted and congratulated Modi and the people of India for a successful election, which is really important as well, because it shows that with the loss of the support that Modi thought he had, to the extent that the democratic process is definitely working in India, that it was much less influenced by the threat of jail or other penalties for speaking out against the Modi government and the opposition. So I think that was an important telltale sign as to where politics are heading there. And I think that in the long term, that's a very positive sign for everyone in India, of all religions, of all backgrounds. So that's, again, what I think is very important. This article here, he went on again to say that the India general election is one of the most crucial ones, as the new government will be formed amid intense geopolitical tensions and wide trade disruptions. And again, that brings us back to the rule of law and the extrajudicial killings that have taken place around the world and attempted assassinations. So that's had a large impact. I know that Canada has halted some trade and trade talks as a result of this. So it has played a role within the election as well. Our Prime Minister here in Canada, Justin Trudeau, went on to extend his wishes on X. So this was a X, formerly Twitter, post congratulating to the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, on his electoral victory. Canada stands ready to work with his government to advance the relationship between our nation's peoples. Now, this part here at the ending was what I found very fascinating. And it goes on to state, anchored to human rights, diversity, and the rule of law. Once again, coming back to the involvement or potential involvement of the India government in the extrajudicial killing of foreign citizens on foreign soil. So I think that was a very important part, that Justin Trudeau had the gumption and the courage to speak up, even in a congratulatory tweet that he put out there. I think that's very important worldwide.
A definite sting in the tail.
That I thought was interesting was the U.S. president. Of course, they are still in talks and in growing their trade partnerships. However, of course, recent issues with, again, the extrajudicial killings and the attempted assassination of certain Sikh leaders has called into question some of that. But it wasn't so much addressed by the U.S. on that topic. They went on just to state congratulations to Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the National Democratic Alliance on their victory. So he did mention both parties there, which I found interesting. And also the 650 million voters in this historic election. The friendship between our nations is only growing as we unlock a shared future of unlimited potential. So again, looking forward to the trade increases going both ways for each country. Modi replied to the U.S. stating that he was happy to receive a call from his friend Joe Biden. So obviously they had a conversation with all of the calls he was receiving. I'm guessing that wasn't too long of a conversation between them, but enough that they did show an appreciation for the democracy process. And the comprehensive global partnership is poised to witness many new landmarks in the years to come. Again, just touting the benefits of the trade increase between the two nations, and not only how it will benefit the Modi government, but all people of India. And that is very important to ensure that things are moving in the right direction again for the world stage. But again, we need to make sure that human rights and rule of law around the world are respected. So that's those are the two stories that I found very interesting. Was of course, the election itself and the reaction of the international media, but also very importantly, as I stated, the diplomatic way in which world leaders were responding to congratulate Modi, and at the same time have some point of making sure he's aware that there's still a lot to be done in terms of addressing the issues at hand.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of very interesting hidden messages and a lot of those reactions. There's obviously most nations have reacted with unsurprising diplomatic language that actually says congratulations but doesn't say very much around that. But as you say, Canada have very clearly added a little barb in the tail of their message, referring to the rule of law and of course that indirect reference to Hardeep Singh Nijjar and other potential extrajudicial killings. The other one, actually, which I thought was quite interesting, was this one down here, which is Russia. And of course, India has a very strong and historic relationship with Russia. And of course, Putin has said, we attach great importance to the relationship of a particularly privileged strategic partnership with New Delhi. And for those who may not know, India has been supplying Russia with oil, although most of the rest of the world have sanctioned Russia over the Ukraine war. India has taken a very deliberate, I wouldn't even say neutral, quite the opposite. They've actually, on the face of it, sided with Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war by supplying Russia with much needed oil and hydrocarbons. So, but of course, that historic relationship, particularly highlighted here with Putin, he makes no bones about it. He says, a particularly privileged strategic partnership, which will really hurt the US and the West, who are at this very moment trying to seduce India away from this relationship. So, yeah, James, let's go on to your third story.
That's right. Yeah, and you're absolutely right about that in the impact that Putin sees it having in his benefit and how he can sway the government there. So you're absolutely right. I agree with you on those points. So when we looked at that, I thought that it was also important with British Columbia. We have one of the largest Indian populations, Indo-Canadians, that make up one of the largest condensed populations of Indians outside of India. So we have a very multicultural situation happening in Canada, as you do there in Europe. But what I found important was also to look at some of the reactions of the Indo-Canadian community here in Canada and some of the comments that people had made. Now, this article here, and I'm just going by the comments on it that I wanted to bring up. And it states, while India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is looking toward a historic third term in office, the country's general election has revealed growing opposition to its leader and that it's drawn reaction from a large Indian diaspora in British Columbia. With the vote count continuing, Modi's Hindu Nationalist Party appears unlikely to secure a majority on its own, despite pre-election hopes of a landslide victory. So again, really pointing out how much of a shortfall there were in terms of the votes that Modi was expecting for his party. So, of course, the results mean that the BJP will need to rely on smaller partners to form a government. That's something that we've already touched on. And Modi, who is now 73, which, he's looking a hell of a lot better than certain U.S. leaders in that age range, let me tell you, or, candidates, we'll call them. But Modi 73, who will become just the second Indian leader to secure power for a third term after Nehru, the country's first prime minister. So it shows that it's going back a fair ways, that it's been quite the up and down and turnover for leaders there. But that's not unlike most countries. So it is really something to note that even though it was not by a majority, that he has actually taken the helm for a third term. So that hopefully speaks to where things are going with that. Samit Bajaj, who moved from India to Surrey, which is actually my community here, she moved in 2019 and described the election in the world's most populous democracy as dynamic. It's always good to have strong opposition. Sorry, he said. The democracy has lived again. I believe I said she there, but my apologies. It's always good to have a strong opposition. Democracy has lived again. He said was particularly impressed with the number of people who turned out to vote. And again, that was over 600 million people that turned out to vote. And that I really take my hat off to people getting involved in the process and having their voices heard, which is so essential to any democracy or any process worldwide. And even when you look at the Khalistan referendums, the ability for people in Canada, in the UK, in the US, in Australia and so forth to have their voices heard, whether or not they were voting yes or no on the referendum, the bigger thing was that they had the opportunity to vote. So it's really good to see how many people in India actually got out and had their voices heard, which is just, as I said, so essential in the world's largest electoral event. So that process took 6 weeks to happen. Now, the 39-year-old documentary writer and producer, also living in Surrey, 39-year-old Jasleen Kaur, was also bringing point to the diaspora, saying that it's mostly anti-Modi here in Canada when you look at the diaspora, but it's not all, it's not all bad either. They do have some respect for advances with government. There's still so much more to do and so much more to accomplish in terms of human rights within India. And as I said, respecting rule of law in other countries. But Kaur said she is proud of the people of India and that they've humbled Modi. So that, again, is a very important line there, I think, that they've humbled him and made him realize that he's not holding as strong of a grip on the country as he thought. And then she closes out by saying that's very exciting for Indians and for us living abroad who watch this election very closely. As I said, with such a high Indian population here in British Columbia and Canada as a whole, of course, many eyes were on the election and the results. So that is very important. And closing out that one, she went on to state that she grew up in Patalia, which is in the Sikh majority state of Punjab, said the election results show people of India care about more than just Hinduism. Instead, they're focused on social issues that affect all Indians. So again, it shows that there's a positive sign of a country that has been divided by religion and other issues over the years, that they are moving closer to being one in terms of a people and respecting each other's beliefs. So I think that really is a historic point and a turning point for India to make that, to make that stand in this election. I think is very, very important to the world as a whole as well, because it will bring some stability. A couple of months ago, she was in India, and she was stating that all the local media spoke about was positive things about Modi, and went on to state, and I quote, "Oh, the theatrics of it," she said, adding that Modi was portrayed as a global peacemaker. I thought it was, I thought that was taking it a bit too far to present him like that, but that's all we saw. The publications were talking about him, so it was very clear he was really capturing the media. So she said one explanation for the election results might have been fatigue that many in India were feeling from seeing Modi and hearing about how wonderful he was all the time. So it could be that it actually caused him more damage than it did to benefit in the electoral result.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of analysts are saying that despite all the expectations of the BJP to sweep again to victory, the campaign was made particularly personal by Narendra Modi. He apparently hinged a lot of the campaign on him as a personality, as almost a personality cult, because he has obviously been a very popular figure. And so some analysts are saying, well, actually, maybe Modi himself is not quite as popular anymore as he used to be. He's been following this very strong nationalist agenda, which has, of course, appealed to the nationalist, the Hindutva core of India. But clearly a lot of people, maybe even of lower castes, have felt maybe if he gets back into power, that those in lower castes are going to find themselves a little bit more marginalised again. And of course, the religious minorities have been feeling that ever since 2014. So yeah, maybe his campaign focused around his own personality has actually backfired. Interesting times. Okay.
That they are indeed.
So I'll move on to my stories now. So I'm going to start with a story that we covered actually just the other day on the channel. And this is a really, I would say, a seismic event in the Punjab. And this is the story of Amritpal Singh, who I'm sure most of our viewers will be fully aware of. Amritpal Singh currently resides in Dibrugarh jail over in Assam, 3,000 kilometres away from the Punjab. And he is a very charismatic character. He's managed to secure a huge populist backing across the Punjab, basically campaigning on some very critical elements, some critical issues, very personal to Punjabis. The Punjab has suffered a lot in recent years with a drug problem. The youth of the Punjab, I mean, there are feelings that drugs have been deliberately poured into the Punjab just to try and taint the Sikh youth and to try and almost seduce them away from the Sikh culture. But Mr. Amritpal Singh himself has been this champion of trying to wean the youth off the drugs and revert them back, drag them back into the good values of Sikh culture. Now, his other big platform, which he's been campaigning on, has of course been Khalistan. And campaigning on Khalistan is the thing that's probably, I think without doubt, raised the ire of the governing party, the BJP. So he was imprisoned just over a year ago under the National Security Act under very spurious charges. He still remains in jail, still without trial. I spoke to his wife myself just some time ago. He's still waiting for genuine legal due process as he resides in jail. So he did the best thing he could do. He put his personality, everything he stands for, up for public validation. He stood for the Kador Sahib constituency in the Punjab in this election, and he secured a record 404,000 votes, more than double his next competitor, his next rival. Now, this sends a very powerful message to New Delhi that Amritpal Singh, this character that New Delhi have grown to probably despise and fear, he has a huge following in the Punjab. And of course, that following are very powerfully pro-Khalistan. Now, interestingly, it will be interesting actually to see what does happen now that he has been essentially elected to the Lok Sabha. A precedent has been set in the past where a previous MP was in fact in jail during his electoral victory, and they had no choice but to release him. The big question is, are they going to release Amritpal Singh? If they do, if New Delhi does, they know they are releasing a potentially very powerful and charismatic figure back into the Punjab. And what will he do when he gets back to the Punjab? He's not going to sit down and relax. He is going to really vitalise that Khalistan vote. He's really going to vitalise the whole Sikh cause, this whole culture that have felt oppressed for so many decades. They're going to start rallying around him. It's going to be a very interesting next few years in the Punjab, I think. And to support that, in the neighbouring constituency, and this is very interesting, the son of Shahid, that's the martyr Beant Singh, Sarabjit Singh Khalsa, emerged victorious in the Faridkot constituency. Now, what's interesting about this is that Sarabjit Singh Khalsa, his father was one of the Sikh bodyguards that assassinated Indira Gandhi. He has stood himself again on a pro-Khalistan ticket, and he has been elected with, I think, around 300,000 votes. So once again, a pro-Khalistan candidate has been hugely voted into his constituency by a large majority. But the message this really sends is this polarisation that has existed for decades between the Sikh community and the central Indian government, which came to an absolute head in 1984 with that terrible attack by the Indian government on the Harmandir Sahib. As a result of that attack, Operation Blue Star, the instigator of that attack, Indira Gandhi, was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguard, Beyant Singh, and it is his son now elected to the Lok Sabha. What message does that send to New Delhi? That this gentleman, this assassin of Indira Gandhi, has now been elected. This is very, very big news. So there's a quote here at the end of this article, and I'll credit Baz News for this very interesting article. Of course, this raises, I think, the very obvious impact of all this. Today's landslide election victory for Amritpal Singh has shattered the Indian narrative that Khalistan has no support with Punjab. These results make it very clear that Khalistan has strong grassroots support in Punjab, despite people's fear of Indian retribution for openly expressing their support. Two very important points here. Firstly, Narendra Modi's defence against the whole Khalistan movement is he has labelled it as a fringe element in the diaspora. Well, for one thing, the Khalistan referendum is most likely to throw that completely out of the field. We do expect a huge, overwhelming majority in the diaspora in support of Khalistan, but it's the people in the Punjab that he claims do not support Khalistan. And here we have, absolutely unambiguously, in a completely democratic vote in the general election, two pro-Khalistan candidates elected with huge majorities. The message is very clear. So that's a fascinating story, James.
That it definitely is, and I think that again it goes back to showing that tides are shifting in India, and with the Modi government in terms of the message that he is getting from the electorate.
Indeed. So let's move on to my second story. Now, let's just change gear here, and this is reverting back to an element that we have touched upon in today's show, and that is, of course, transnational repression. Now, the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar last June in British Columbia. 4 gentlemen currently facing charges, one of which was this gentleman, Amandeep Singh. Now, he was arrested by the RCMP back in November. Now, this article, which appeared in CBC News just the other day, written by a very interesting journalist, Evan Dyer. Evan Dyer is clearly a very well-connected journalist. He produces several articles on a regular basis about this particular issue, but he clearly has very powerful contacts, very interesting contacts within Canadian intelligence, because the scoops he appears with on a regular basis could only come from the intelligence community. And he's come up with a really interesting story here. This is Amandeep Singh, one of the 4 gentlemen arrested for the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. He was arrested one day before a very high-profile wedding which would be attended many high-profile Khalistani campaigners. He was arrested in the same city the day before. What was he doing in that city the day before this wedding at which all these high-profile Khalistani campaigners were going to be attending? One of those includes Gupta Singh Pannoon, the leader of Sikhs for Justice, the organisers of the Khalistan referendum. Now, as it turns out, Gupta Singh Pannoon actually pulled out at the very last minute due to security reasons. Of course, all these gentlemen, these Sikh campaigners who were attending the wedding are already on India's target list. They know that because they've already received warnings from Canadian intelligence that they are targets. There are known threats to their lives. So the implication here is very interesting and very clear, that Amandeep Singh was already in the city, potentially knowing that all these Khalistani campaigners, these very key campaigners, were all going to be in one place at the same time at this wedding. When he was arrested, he was found with weapons on his person. He was arrested at the time with firearms charges. The implication being, have Canadian police and law enforcement prevented a massacre at this wedding of Khalistani campaigners? We know that transnational repression includes this assassination program of Khalistani campaigners, as we've seen firstly with Hardeep Singh Nijjar and of course with the thwarted plot of Gupta Singh Panoon in New York. And this guy, Amandeep Singh, caught in the same city the day before the wedding. Wow. I mean, it could have been a very, very different story if the RCMP hadn't been there. And they did actually admit that the arrest was by no accident. Clearly, they had been fed intelligence by, one would assume, the Canadian intelligence community that something was afoot. So, James, interesting things in Canada.
Very interesting. And on a side note to that is back at the end of last year, the media was reporting a inevitable arrest in the murder of Mr. Nijjar. And what I thought was interesting is that although they made the announcement that the arrests were coming very soon at that time, it actually took quite a number of months before the arrests actually happened. And it makes me wonder if they were, these individuals were under surveillance and that the RCMP were looking for more than just the assassination of Mr. Nijjar, but watching them on other matters that may not be public at this point.
Yeah. Well, I think the coming months will be very interesting to see what happens once these guys appear in court, and one wonders how much intelligence will be revealed as the legal process continues.
Absolutely, and given that I'm 20 minutes from the courthouse where the procedures are taking place, we'll definitely have a lot of updates on our show and a lot of content and interviews from people attending the process.
Good, and we do look forward to that. So for our next segment of the show, we just wanted to touch on a few comments that we received. We will continue to do this. We will continue to do this over coming shows because, of course, we do receive many comments after our videos, and many of them are certainly justified responses in different manners. Now, I wanted to cover just the comments after this story we did on the story on the government mission to kill Sikhs. This is Nikhil Gupta. This is the gentleman currently in the Czech Republic who was charged by the US Department of Justice for, again, the thwarted plot on or the potential assassination of Gupta Singh Panoon. Now, this the top comment actually on the story by Jana Gra 9781. He says, or she says, everything is crystal clear. Once Gupta comes to the USA, he will spill the beans. He will talk like a parrot. Now, this is a big question. Of course, Nikhil Gupta does not want to be extradited back to the US because in the US he will face a very, very serious charge of first-degree murder, which potentially means either execution, depending in which state he's tried, or certainly a very, very long term in jail. Now, the precedent has been set many times in the US in similar situations where a plea bargain is often offered to the guilty as charged, and in return for spilling the beans, as this comment says, they end up with a reduced sentence. Now, I have no doubt that Mr. Nikhil Gupta, when he's facing 30 or 40 years in jail, will no doubt be thinking of himself, and it will be very interesting to hear what intelligence he will reveal, because of course what the world is waiting to hear is what are the links between Mr. Nikhil Gupta and the US government. And of course that will no doubt go through Indian intelligence. And then the next comment is from Sack Hack, and that comment goes, the developed world need to create principled framework for democracy, education, justice system, which create a playing field without caste, colour, gender, religion and nationality, and then enforce it. Well, this is interesting because actually the West already does have a principled framework for democracy. And of course, education, we have a very mature legal system, a justice system. And we, of course, have equal rights. We have huge reams of legislation that ensures that equality is always at the forefront. But the key point here is, and then enforce it in any sphere of relations with other countries. And this goes back to your news item, James. Of course, Prime Minister Trudeau, with that little sting in the tail of his diplomatic congratulations to Narendra Modi, where he said the rule of law matters. And this comment, this brings it up, is that the West must enforce this rule of law, this framework of democracy, education system, etc. and they must enforce it in all relations with India and, of course, make it conditional. James, any comments from you?
No, I think that you've hit it right on there. The importance that people are seeing in terms of the international respect for rule of law and for the sovereignty of other nations. So it's going to be very important to respect that, but it's also going to be very important to see what Mr. Gupta has to say when he does get that deal, or if there is a deal to be made when he starts speaking.
An awful lot, one imagines. Right. Our final comment, I love this comment. This is from Parminder Atwal. This was a story where we covered recently about Samant Gol. Samant Gol is named as CC1 for those who've been following the story of the thwarted assassination plot on Gurpatwant Singh Panoon. It referred to an Indian agent, a senior Indian agent in the Indian intelligence services, who has since been identified as Samant Gol, this gentleman here. And his background, he spent many years in Dubai as a diplomat for India. And it is alleged that during his time in Dubai, he spent a lot of that time nurturing his network with the criminal fraternity, which of course potentially has come into huge use to channel funds across to the criminal networks in the US to then launch these assassination operations against the Khalistani campaigners. And this comment here, Parminder Atwal, says, we are talking bloody rubbish, apparently. Well, we may well be, but I would say every fact that we do broadcast is corroborated. We do speculate, and of course, when we are speculating, we do make it very clear that we are speculating. But he does go on to say that Western countries are even worse, which actually contradicts the first part of that, because you're implying that actually it has been going on. And yes, Western countries are even worse. I wouldn't say they're worse, but certainly Western countries are by no means angels. And the West, particularly America, has been criticised for double standards on many things. That we can't defend. All we can do is call it out when we see it. Don't you agree, James?
I agree, and that's part of the goal of our program here, Angus, is to educate and bring awareness to issues such as this one.
And the final comment is, we see this actually a few times, and I did want to highlight this one just to actually make the point. Please convert this news in Punjabi language will be helpful. Yes, we do get asked this. Unfortunately, James and myself do not speak a word of Punjabi, much as we try. And the channel itself, if you go onto our channel, most of the material on the channel is in the Punjabi language. So please do go see the Punjabi language material. We exist to broadcast in English, essentially for our primarily English-speaking audience. So apologies, but we do hope you find sufficient material on the channel. So, for our final segment, we're going to get a bit more serious. We do want to take a look at those terrible events of 40 years ago. Events that, of course, have been commemorated all this week across the world, and particularly by the Sikh community. Now, for a detailed breakdown of what happened leading up to Operation Blue Star, the terrible military assault itself and the aftermath, which saw the instigator of Blue Star, Indira Gandhi, assassinated for that act of aggression, and of course the terrible Sikh genocide that followed, do of course take a look at our series of in-depth videos on our channel where we cover those events. But for the next 8 or 10 days or so, James and myself, we wanted to give you just a brief summary of what happened on a day-by-day basis over those first days of June 1984. So for those maybe not familiar with the events, as they happened, they can follow along and get an idea of just how deliberate and calculated that massacre in the Harmandir Sahib was. So what I would like to do for this segment, I'm going to credit, let me just call this up here. I want to credit the National Sikh Youth Federation because they produced on their website a very good, very detailed summary of those events. And I'm going to use their summary, and many thanks to them for this. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to give you, on the 1st of June, 1984, when it first kicked off. Let me read you the summary of what happened on the very first day before Operation Blue Star was fully launched. In 1982, Sant Bhindranwale launched the Dharam Yudh Morcha, and these were peaceful protests to support the implementation of the Anandpur Sahib resolution. Now, during these morche, thousands of Sikhs courted arrest. Now, a respected journalist at the time, Kuldip Nair, he wrote, When the agitation began nearly 2 years ago, it was led by reasonable men seeking a reasonable settlement of reasonable demands. And at least 3 times there were prospects of agreement at a negotiating table, but each time Prime Minister Indira Gandhi sabotaged the agreement. And that's very crucial, that. So after nearly 2 years of peaceful agitations, approximately 200 Sikhs were killed by the security forces, and over 100,000 Sikhs had courted arrest. However, all negotiations with the government had failed. The Akali Dal, that's the Sikh political party in the Punjab, called for the next stage of civil disobedience, which was to withhold the grain distributed from the Punjab to the rest of India. And this was to be done on the 3rd of June 1984, in a means of course, pressuring the government. Now, knowing that this would force settling with the Sikhs, the Indian government, instead of negotiating, opted for a military option, Operation Blue Star, which had been prepared for over a year earlier to crush and silence the Sikh agitation. So tens of thousands of army troops were deployed, and on the 1st of June, the Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple, was surrounded. The Border Security Force and the Central Reserve Police Force, under orders of the army, started firing upon the complex, in which on that first day at least 8 people died. And there the Battle of Amritsar had begun, and of course 10 days of terror had started. Now, just add to that the reason the complex was so full of thousands and even tens of thousands of people, men, women and children, was the June the 3rd was a celebration day, the 5th Guru, Guru Arjan Dev Ji's Shahidi Day, his martyrdom day. So the complex was packed with innocent men, women and children just when Operation Blue Star was launched. And of course, over the coming shows, I do urge you to continue watching, because we will always end up with a segment just on a day-by-day basis covering those terrible events and just the brutal massacre that ensued, and of course the aftermath thereafter. So a very serious and sad way to end the show. So there you have it. That was Perspectives. We do hope you enjoyed the show. Please do feel free to drop us a message either below or to our email. That's message@satlegetv.com on any news items that you picked up that you think we should be talking about. And we'll be covering several emails that we received recently in shows over the coming days. So if you'd like to be featured, then you know where to send your message. But in the meantime, it's goodbye from myself and it's goodbye from James.
We'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning in and joining us on this journey.
You've been watching Perspectives. We'll see you next time.